Welcome to HorrorBabble. Artifacts of Horror Volume 2 concludes today with a previously unpublished work by the obscure author C.P. Howard, The Man Who Made Faces. The curious tale tells of a man haunted by a past mistake. We hope you enjoyed this one, folks, and we hope you've enjoyed the series. Thanks as always for your support. The Man Who Made Faces by C.P. Howard. 1. Deception is the game of the mask maker, barked Nigel Jones, addressing the smattering of students before him. Keep this in mind as we move forward. The lecture hall was a modest one, but still his words echoed from wall to wall, emphasizing the failure of his cause. Jones was an artist, a man of passion and ambition, and yet there he was, straddling the void between poverty and the dream, incapable of sparking the imaginations of 12 heavy-lidded teenagers. In one hand, his dominant hand, he held a plain papier-mâché mask, its empty eyes staring at the floor. This, he continued, raising the mask after the fashion of an Olympic medal, is where your journey begins. The blank canvas, as it were. The face. A face. Any face. The sound of his own voice irritated him, made him irrationally self-conscious. His cheeks burned with an uncharacteristic flush. Linda Wallace noticed the blush, and Jones saw that she noticed. This only intensified the sensation, his eyes remaining on the young lady a fraction of a second too long, a fraction of a second coloured by an expression not fit for a man in his position. Any face, Jones repeated, unaware that Mike Bennett had caught the awkward exchange and was silently fuming. After all, Wallace was Bennett's girl. There wasn't a chance in hell he was going to let a dumpy lecturer double his age, leer at her, and get away with it. So we skip ahead a couple of hours, to the unfortunate moment Nigel Jones is making his way across the school car park when he's accosted by an enraged Mike Bennett. Bennett's a big lad, with big arms and big hands, and has no trouble whatsoever in grabbing Jones by the shoulders and pushing him to the ground. Jones has barely opened his mouth in protest when Bennett's on top of him, a raging mass silhouetted by the harsh glare of the street lamp above. He's pummeling Jones, fists rising and falling like sledgehammers striking stone, pounding jaw, cheekbone, nose, and head with alarming brutality. "You fucking pervert," Bennett spits, kicking him now. "Don't you ever look at her like that again." But Jones is in no position to respond. He's bewildered, overwhelmed, throbbing from head to toe, his thoughts a jumble. He glimpses one final fist falling like a boulder from a cliff before he's knocked into oblivion. Mike Bennett stumbled out of a backstreet bar, drunk and disorderly. 5 years had passed following the attack on his former teacher, Nigel Jones, and life hadn't been good to him. Linda Wallace had long since abandoned him, as had his prospects for further education. He'd turned to booze at the tender age of 19, and by 23 was a hopeless alcoholic. Eruptions of violence were commonplace, often landing him behind bars for days at a time. Ironically, no punishment had followed his terrible assault on Jones. He'd left the hapless figure broken and bleeding on the cold ground, heedless of the extent of the wounds he'd inflicted, retreating to his lair in the basement of his parents' home, his heavy fists bruised and aching, stained with blood. And there he'd remain for some time, awaiting the inevitable knock at the door, a knock that, as luck would have it, never came. Clandestine inquiries were made, and it transpired that, of course, Jones had been admitted to hospital, and, as a result of his injuries, had fallen into a coma. The attack occurred outside of the range of closed-circuit television, and there were no witnesses, and so, in effect, Mike Bennett had got away with it, for the time being at least. He certainly wouldn't be turning himself in at the nearest police station. But he felt no joy, no reprieve, just a severe ramping up of latent rage, poorly restrained by drink and drugs. After a while, talk of Nigel Jones and his whereabouts disappeared from the rumour mill, but the thought of what might have become of him haunted Bennett. The big lad fell into a spiral of destructive behaviours, fueled by nightmare visions involving the collapsing face of Jones, a face once round and pudgy, now gaunt and deformed, nose broad and flat, oozing blood, eyes like slots, black and bulging, lips like dinghies, cheeks like pancakes. And it was such an image that filled his intoxicated brain as he staggered across the road, narrowly avoiding the late afternoon traffic, navigating the winding streets of the city, in search of the flat above MS News. Outside the flat, his home for the last 2 years, Mark Sugar, the proprietor of the newsagents over which his humble abode floated, popped his skinny head out of the shop and handed Bennett a package. "Parcel for you," Sugar said in his inimitable way, a voice at once dull and shrill. "Postie dropped it this morning." "Cheers," Bennett slurred, clutching the unexpected delivery. In the small living room of his flat, Bennett, his head spinning and unsteady on his feet, inspected the contents of the package. He paid no mind to the poorly handwritten address on the top of the small box, quickly discarding it, as his eyes fell on what lay within. It was a papier-mâché mask. In spite of his inebriation, Bennett recognized the crude depiction of his own face, squinted at it and scowled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The mask scowled back, the empty eye-holes bottomless pits, its lips downturned in mocking tragedy. His pock-marked complexion had been captured, the surface of the mask coarse and uneven, hideous to the touch. Ghastly though the thing was, Bennett found himself captivated by it, wanting to understand its purpose, even as he rocked back and forth involuntarily on the spot. Then and there he knew the creator of the mask was sending a message he wasn't sure he wanted to fully comprehend. But things were only going to get stranger for the young drunk. The arrival of the papier-mâché mask had a profound effect on Mike Bennett. He stopped drinking, found himself a job, tidied up the car boot sale dumping ground that was his flat. On some level, the sardonic stare of that moulded face had touched his soul, impressing him with its muted disparagement. To be in its presence was to suffer belittlement, and it seemed that the only way to overcome it was to dispense with his vices. And with each lifestyle change he made, be it the casting aside of booze or the procurement of employment, the expression the mask wore seemed to soften somewhat, like an obsessive parent subtly impressed by their offspring's exemplary progress at school. The staring black eyes receded, the lips threatened to turn upwards, the abrasive surface smoothed out. The face was altogether brighter, rejuvenated. I think it has to be said that these apparent transformations might have been merely the result of changes in lighting. The mask seen under the glare of the television, the intrusive dazzle of the moon, the soft glow of several standard lamps. But this was a conception that Bennett never once considered. For a time thereafter, the young man approached the status of an even-tempered, measured individual with a grip on life's basic necessities. He looked back on his former habits with disdain, regretted his actions deeply, and it was during these morbid reflections that his thoughts frequently returned to the violent attack on Nigel Jones, as he struggled to reconcile old Bennett with the new one. What had become of Jones after his supposed coma? The man had simply disappeared from the surface of the planet, and this troubled Bennett, more so as he laid his eyes on the moulded face suspended from a panel pin in the living room, still none the wiser as to its origin. These contemplations made sleeping difficult, and he would lie there, tossing and turning, reliving his lowest moments. If only he could see Linda again, the one that got away. Had she ever really felt anything for him? Or had she always been hot for teacher, as he'd suspected? Such thoughts plagued the 17-year-old mind, particularly the troubled 17-year-old mind. She'd taken her leave shortly after the attack on Jones had become public knowledge. She'd never accused him directly, but the look on her face the moment she saw the dark bruises decorating his bloated knuckles said everything. No, he wouldn't be seeing Linda again. She'd fled for the hills. Or perhaps, he would think as he lay in bed, tormented by his former life, she'd gone off with Jones after all. It was quite possible the two had buggered off somewhere, overseas probably, in an effort to get as far away from their aggressor as possible. It was in these dire moments that Bennett would return to the present, acutely aware of the importance of looking forwards, not backwards. 2. Bennett first saw the stranger at work. He held a position as a shelf filler at a small supermarket, covering fresh produce. He worked the late shift, 2 through 10, which, as anybody who has ever worked in retail will attest, is probably the least desirable shift one can work. Bennett, however, was quite fond of the shift, finding the 7 through 10 portion especially interesting. Characters shopped after 7, those eccentric of dress and quiet of demeanor, illegitimate couples and guarded loners. He'd observed these shoppers as he stacked the shelves, intrigued by their furtive ways. The stranger was sighted towards the end of his shift one night, an individual incongruous with the other customers going about their late evening business. This shopper, espied at the opposite end of the aisle Bennett was working, stood stock still, seemingly watching him. The watcher was of average height and build, wearing a nondescript duffel coat, jeans, and dark boots. Male or female, Bennett couldn't be sure from where he stood, nor would it have mattered, for it was the impression of the watcher's face that caught his attention, a blank face, reminiscent of a slasher film antagonist, a white mask of which only the dark eye-holes were visible. Dark eye-holes, and the suggestion of a nose and mouth. Disheveled black hair tumbled from the crown, looking for all the world as unsettling and false as the face below it. Bennett twitched and shuffled on the spot, wanting to look away, but finding it impossible to do so. The watcher held his attention. There was something in that barely seen face that called to him, something of guile in those frozen features. He grinned, then winced, his own face betraying his befuddlement. Perhaps he would have confronted the stranger, had the standoff continued, but as it was, Bennett was approached by a customer in quest of yarrow, forcing him to move away. When finally he returned to the aisle, the watcher was gone, leaving him somewhat frustrated. Who or what had he seen? Just another solitary oddball? He scratched his head, puzzled. The faces he made. In the days that followed, there were further sightings of the stranger, each signaled by that sense of creeping flesh, the hairs on the back of the neck standing on end. Bennett was making his way through the center of town, in broad daylight, when he caught a glimpse of the watcher standing amongst a group at a bus stop. The duffel coat, jeans, and boots, but most notably the porcelain face, its dark eyes tracking his progress. Another time he was taking a shortcut across the park, where, standing quite conspicuously by the rusty swings of the abandoned children's play area, he saw the stranger again, adopting the same inanimate stance, watching him intently. Not even a trip to Wingate Hill to see his mother offered respite from the sensation of being observed, for standing at the far end of the cul-de-sac on which she lived, partially concealed by the wild canopy of a leaning tree, was the dreaded figure in its customary attire, waiting, watching. Bennett discussed the situation with his mother, escorting her in an understandably frantic fashion to the bay window in order to point out his would-be stalker. But, as had been the case with each and every sighting of the figure, a second glance revealed nothing at all. The watcher had vanished, just as it had at the supermarket, the bus stop, the children's play area. Mrs. Bennet was visibly disturbed by what her son was telling her, more so when he attempted to connect the sighting to Nigel Jones, the teacher he'd practically left for dead, on the empty grounds of the school. "He's taunting me, Mum," Bennet yammered. "He wants to get me back for what I did to him." "You don't even know what you did to him," Mrs. Bennet blurted, after which she covered her mouth with her hands, as if she'd revealed something unintentionally. "What?" Bennet said, rounding on her. "What do you mean?" "Forget it," she said. I shouldn't have said anything." "Wait a minute. If you know something, Mum, you have to tell me." Mrs. Bennet took a deep breath and sank into the armchair she'd been perched on. "I heard it through the grapevine," she began guiltily. "He was a mess, Mike. Severe facial trauma. We didn't hear about him because he didn't want anyone to hear about him. They took him down to London for reconstructive surgery. At least, that's what I was told." "Told? Who told you?" I can't remember," she stammered, shaking her head dismissively. "I think it was Harry Rice." Rice had been the school headmaster, probably still was, for all Bennet knew. His mother went on to tell him that Rice had contacted her shortly after the attack. He'd spoken to Jones, who'd stated that Bennet was the culprit, but that he didn't want to press charges. "That always bothered me," Mrs. Bennet said. "Why wouldn't he want to press charges? Why take himself away?" The young man shook his head. He didn't like what he was hearing, not a bit of it. His strange stalker out there. Was it Jones after all, back for revenge? Was his girl to drive him insane? And what about the mask? The very mask that right at that moment was hanging on the wall of his living room. Was Jones responsible for that? Bennet shuddered. "Why don't we take a look at things from the other side? There's a room, a dark room, not too far from Bennet's flat above the paper shop. It's a temporary space, a base of operations, for want of a better phrase. A couple of lamps cast light on certain parts of the room. A pair of heavy-looking boots sit in the spotlight of one of them, and a cheap fiberboard desk rests under the glow of another. The desk is a workstation filled with materials, newspaper strips, a dozen paintbrushes, a bowl of water, bags of plain flour. It's a craftsman's setup, typically chaotic. 2 hands bind the materials. Flour is added to the water, mixed vigorously with a wooden spoon. The strips of newspaper are dipped in the mixture, then carefully added to a crude mold, the template from which a mask will be made. There are other masks in the dark room, many plain faces, some lost in shadow, others on the periphery of light. It's a strange place, a den born of obsession. The mask maker is mumbling now, uttering illegible obeisance to something present but unseen, something of shadow, buzzing between the lights. It's in the air, this thing, drifting from mask to mask, seeing through their eyes, studying the tangible world it desperately wishes to inhabit. "Bennet," we hear from lips that don't move. "Bennet," it repeats, in a low voice impossible to describe. The figure at the desk completes the task at hand, suspending the wet creation from a line above the workstation. Admiring its work, the figure takes a step back, into the waiting maw of the bodiless thing in the shadows. The touch of the thing is a laudatory caress. It is very pleased with the figure's latest creation. Bennett, we hear once more, as our eyes are drawn to that glossy mask, the perfect likeness of a scowling, eyeless Mike Bennett. There isn't much more to tell. Mike Bennett's fate, it would seem, was determined by that violent outburst at the tender age of 17. And it was with thoughts of an indifferent universe, in whose galaxies, nebulae, stars, and planets continued their unconscious journeys, that Bennett returned to the confines of his little flat, his overwrought brain buzzing. The trip home had been arduous, a good 4-mile walk during which he felt eyes on him at regular intervals, black hollows that promised only annihilation. Waiting for him on the living-room wall was his papier-mâché likeness, its features contorted now by the glare of passing headlights, a seemingly endless stream of them. He saw the gamut of human emotions there, captured on paper. Anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and lastly surprise, an emotion he himself was now experiencing, owing to a glance out of the corner of his eye that had revealed the watcher outside, just across the street, looking up at him through the window, its blank gaze dazzling his senses. "Who are you?" he yelled at the glass, the sound absorbed by the double glazing. "What do you want from me?" And it smiled. The paper face of the watcher grinned, revealing a third cavernous void in addition to the 2 eye-holes. It was a dreadful thing to behold, at once plain and abstract, setting Bennett's hair on end like a charge of static. His hands went to the supercharged strands, yanking at them like foreign objects, shaking his head in astonishment. But the worst was yet to come. Bennett stumbled backwards, forcing himself to look away from the monstrosity outside, only to discover another grinning facade in his midst. The mask on the wall was leering at him now, in a crooked sneer that revealed teeth like his, but yellow and cracked, like the crumbling fangs of the elderly or disease-stricken. He tried to look away, but found that he couldn't. It was like looking into a mirror, forced to confront his imperfections, knowing full well that there was nothing he could do about them, trapped as he was by the mistakes he'd made, the risks he'd taken. "Mike," came a voice over his shoulder, a whisper like a breath of air. He spun around, coming face to face with the stranger standing there, a figure much smaller than himself, a figure possessing the unmistakable curves of a woman, curves somehow familiar to him. The duffel coat couldn't hide those lines, nor could the jeans. But try as he might, squinting and rubbing his eyes like a man drenched in pepper spray, he couldn't see the face of the stranger. It was a blur, a mass of achromatic shades, like the face of a criminal blurred out on television. Then up came the hands, the lithe, colourless hands, in a rapid groping at his face. They clawed at him, long nails scratching his skin, drawing blood almost instantly. He tried to defend himself, tried to stop the cat-like grazing, but he was powerless to prevent it. In a matter of seconds, the sharp claws had cut through the epidermis and dermis, and were making light work of the subcutaneous tissue, seeking muscle and bone. The scene was ghastly in the extreme, the walls of Bennett's living room fairly covered with blood, fats, and minerals. He wanted to scream, but found that he could only manage a strained groan, this due to the fact that his mouth was no longer a mouth, but a wide gash from ear to ear, from out of which flopped a lacerated tongue, split in two like the tongue of a lizard. But we needn't go on with the details of Bennett's awful defacement. Suffice it to say, his minutes were numbered. He slumped to the floor, his consciousness having retreated to minimum safe distance, watching the maniacal figure before his blood-smeared eyes from the end of a long and dark tunnel. As his last handful of breaths came and went, the face of his attacker was revealed. A mask was removed, the same blank face that had stalked him. But it wasn't Nigel Jones, nor was it a stranger. It was the clean, beautiful face of Linda Wallace. The faces she made. Mike Bennett's body was discovered 2 days later, after a number of calls placed by his mother and employer had gone unanswered. Police had found him in the living room of his flat, lying face down on the threadbare carpet. The cause of death was unable to be determined, as there was no evidence of physical injury, and, according to the medical examiner, Bennett had been a healthy young man, not suffering from any known disease, nor had he ingested anything that would have resulted in his untimely end. The only remarkable oddity in the room was the papier-mâché mask on the wall, a mask in Bennett's likeness, thoroughly shredded and hanging in tatters. A small penknife was found on the floor nearby. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,